The IV needle was already in my left hand, taped down with strips of white medical tape that pulled at the thin skin near my knuckles. I'd been lying in that hospital bed for 2 hours, listening to the monitors beep, watching the saline drip in slow, rhythmic drops through the plastic tube, trying to keep my breathing steady. The surgery was scheduled for 11 o'clock. It was 10:43. And then I heard them. Just outside the curtain, close enough that I could make out every word my daughter Renee and her husband Marcus were whispering. I heard my name. I heard the words, power of attorney. And then I heard Marcus say, if she doesn't come out of this the way we're hoping, we'll need to move fast on the Clarksville property. I lay completely still in that thin cotton gown, staring up at the fluorescent light above me, and I felt something inside me go very, very quiet. That was the moment I realized I wasn't the patient, I was the plan. You have to understand something about Renee and me before I can tell you how we got to that hospital room. She was my whole world for 32 years. After her father, Gerald, passed from a heart attack in the winter of 2017, it was just the two of us, the way it had been when she was small and Gerald worked overnight shifts at the plant. I raised that girl on macaroni and cheese and library cards and Saturday morning cartoons, and I loved her with everything I had. When she cried, I cried. When she succeeded, I felt like I had wings. That kind of love doesn't have a logical foundation. It just is. It's bone deep and permanent, and it makes you, if you're not careful, willfully blind. After Gerald died, Renee started calling more, visiting more. She and Marcus had been married 4 years by then, and I'll admit I was grateful for the company in that big house in Clarksville, Tennessee, the same house Gerald and I had bought in 1989 for $94,000 and paid off over 30 years. It sat on just under an acre, had a wraparound porch, a detached garage, and a pecan tree in the backyard that Gerald had planted from a seedling. That house was everything. It was our whole life pressed into wood and brick and red clay soil. Renee suggested, gently at first, that I think about moving closer to her and Marcus in Nashville. She said it would be easier for them to help me, that I shouldn't be alone, that the Clarksville house was too big for one person and too much upkeep. I told her I was fine. I was 68 years old, still driving, still gardening, still walking 2 miles every morning down Riverside Drive before the heat set in. But she kept circling back to it, and slowly, the way water shapes stone, I started to believe that maybe she had a point. Maybe I was being stubborn. Maybe I owed it to her, after everything she and Marcus were doing for me, to at least be reasonable. I co-signed on their home equity loan in the spring of 2019, $30,000. Marcus said it was to renovate the kitchen, get the house in shape, build equity. He laid out spreadsheets across my kitchen table and walked me through numbers while Renee made us chamomile tea and nodded along. I signed the papers. I didn't consult a lawyer. I trusted my daughter's husband the way I trusted my daughter, completely and without condition, because I had never been given a reason not to. I babysat my grandchildren, Lily and Cooper, every Tuesday and Thursday for 18 months so that Renee could take on extra hours at the dental practice where she worked front desk. I drove them to soccer and dance and pediatrician appointments. I cooked dinner twice a week and left containers of soup and casseroles in their refrigerator. When their dryer broke in January 2020, they did laundry at my house for 6 weeks. I didn't mind any of it. I want to be clear about that. I didn't keep score. I just loved them and showed up, the way mothers do. But somewhere in 2021, things began to shift in ways I couldn't quite name at the time. Looking back now, I can see every red flag as clearly as a highway sign. But when you're inside it, when the person doing it is someone you'd lay down your life for, your brain works very hard to explain away what your gut is screaming. Marcus started bringing up my finances in conversation more often. Casual questions at first. Mom, do you have a financial advisor? Have you thought about what happens to the house if something happens to you? He used the word estate like it was a natural word to work into dinner conversation. In February of 2022, he sat me down at their kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and asked me if I'd updated my will since Gerald passed. I hadn't. He said that was something I really needed to take care of. He knew an attorney, a friend of his, who could draw up documents quickly and affordably. I met with that attorney, a man named Blunt, in a beige office park off the interstate. Renee came with me. I remember feeling rushed, though I couldn't say why. Blunt was efficient and pleasant and spoke in the kind of calm, authoritative voice that makes you feel foolish to ask questions. Within 40 minutes, I had signed a new will and a medical power of attorney that designated Renee as my primary decision-maker in the event I was incapacitated. I walked out thinking I had been responsible. I walked out thinking I had taken care of things for my family. The diagnosis came in January of this year. A heart valve issue, the kind that probably been brewing quietly for years and finally announced itself during a routine physical. My cardiologist, Dr. Okonkwo, explained that I needed a valve replacement surgery. It was serious, but not uncommon. The survival rate was high, the recovery would take time, but most patients my age with my overall health profile did very well. She was reassuring and direct, and I liked her immediately. Renee insisted on being at every appointment. She took notes on her phone, she asked questions I wouldn't have thought to ask about recovery timelines and post-surgical care, and whether I would need assisted living during rehabilitation. At the time, I thought she was being a devoted daughter. I leaned into her. I let her handle the scheduling, the pre-op consultations, the paperwork. I was scared, the way anyone is scared when they're told their heart needs to be opened up and repaired, and Renee stepping in felt like grace. The night before the surgery, she brought me to the hospital for pre-admission. She held my hand in the intake room and told me everything was going to be fine. Her eyes were wet. I patted her hand and told her not to worry. We ordered in Thai food to the hospital room and watched a rerun of a cooking competition show, and she kissed my forehead before she left at 9 o'clock. I fell asleep thinking how lucky I was to have her. I woke at 5 a.m., the way I always do, early and alert, my body's still running on a lifetime of habit. The room was quiet except for the monitors. The nurses had already started the pre-op preparations, checking vitals, adjusting the IV, going over the surgical checklist with me in the gentle, practiced way hospital staff have of making the terrifying feel routine. By 9 a.m., I was prepped, the anesthesiologist had stopped by to introduce himself, and I was lying back in the bed with nothing left to do but wait and try not to think too hard. Renee and Marcus arrived at 10:15. They came in together, Marcus with coffee cups, Renee with a small tote bag she'd packed with things for my recovery room, a soft blanket, a paperback, lip balm, the kind of details that feel like love. We talked for a little while. I told them I felt calm. Marcus squeezed my foot through the blanket and said, "You're going to do great, Mom." They stepped out when a nurse came in to do a final check, saying they'd wait just outside and give me some privacy. The curtain slid closed, and that's when I heard them. I have played those 60 seconds back in my mind so many times that the words are carved into me now. Marcus's voice, low and deliberate, Blunt confirmed the power of attorney is solid. If she comes out of this compromised in any way, we move on the property within 30 days. The insurance payout combined with the house would clear everything. And then Renee, not disagreeing, not horrified, just asking in a hushed, practical voice, and if she's fine, if it goes normally, and Marcus, then we wait. We keep being patient. But one way or another, that house is the exit strategy. A pause, and then Renee quietly, I know. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I stared at that fluorescent light and I breathed. Every instinct in me wanted to scream, to throw back the curtain, to say their names in the voice I used when Renee was 11 and I caught her in a lie. But something else, something older and steadier, told me to be still, told me that panic was not my friend right now, told me that I was in a hospital bed with an IV in my hand, and that if I wanted to protect myself, I needed to think. I have never been a dramatic woman. I grew up in a house where you solved problems quietly and kept your dignity no matter what. My mother's favorite saying was, "You can fall apart later. Right now, be useful." So I breathed. I cataloged what I knew. The medical power of attorney was signed and filed. The will named Renee as sole beneficiary. The Clarksville house was in my name only, but with Renee holding power of attorney over my health care, if this surgery left me even partially incapacitated, she would have enormous leverage over my next steps. And Marcus clearly already had a timeline, an exit strategy, he'd called me. My life was someone's exit strategy. The curtain moved. Renee came back in, and her face was composed and warm, and so utterly familiar that for one devastating second, I almost convinced myself I'd misheard. She sat on the edge of the chair beside my bed and took my hand and said, "You okay, Mom? You look pale." I told her I was just nervous. I asked her if she could get me some water. She smiled and said, "Of course," and stepped out again. The moment she was gone, I pressed the call button. The nurse who came in was a young woman named Deborah, compact and efficient with a silver cross around her neck. I told her calmly that I needed to speak with a patient advocate or a hospital administrator before the surgery proceeded. She looked at me carefully, the way nurses do when they're deciding whether you're anxious or whether something is actually wrong. I said, "I'm not confused and I'm not having second thoughts about the procedure. I have a legal matter I need to address privately before I consent to go under anesthesia, and I need about 30 minutes. Deborah looked at me another moment and then nodded and said she would find someone. The patient advocate who came was a soft-spoken man in his 50s named Raymond Dill. He pulled the curtain tight and sat in the chair beside me, and I told him exactly what I had heard, quietly and clearly, without drama or tears. I told him I needed to know whether I could revoke my medical power of attorney before the surgery. He said yes. I told him I needed to do that right now. He said he would get the paperwork. I also asked Raymond if there was a phone I could use privately. I called my oldest friend in the world, a woman named Gloria Simmons, who had been my neighbor on Chestnut Street for 22 years before she moved to Memphis to be near her sister. Gloria is 71 years old and sharp as a tack, and she has known me since our daughters were in diapers together. When I told her what I'd overheard, she was silent for exactly 3 seconds, and then she said, "I'm calling my nephew." Her nephew Harold is a probate and estate attorney in Memphis with 30 years of experience. He was on the phone with me within 15 minutes. Harold Simmons walked me through my options in a calm, measured voice while Raymond Dill sat discreetly near the door. Harold said the medical power of attorney could be revoked immediately with a signed and witnessed document. He said the will was more complicated but not irreversible. He said the co-signed loan was a separate matter but absolutely worth examining. He said, "You haven't lost anything that can't be reclaimed, but we need to move today." I told him to do whatever needed to be done. I told Deborah, the nurse, that I was revoking the power of attorney before consenting to surgery, and I signed the document that Raymond produced with 2 nurses serving as witnesses. When Renee came back into the room, I was sitting up slightly in the bed, my hands folded on top of the blanket, my face as still as I could manage. She knew immediately that something had changed. I watched it move across her face, the slight flicker of uncertainty, the recalibration. She said, "Mom, what's going on? They said the surgery is delayed." I told her we needed to talk. I told her I'd heard her conversation with Marcus. I watched the color leave her face. She tried several things in the next 20 minutes. First, she said I had misunderstood. Then she said Marcus had been speaking hypothetically, that it wasn't what it sounded like, that he was just being practical the way men like Marcus are practical. Then her eyes filled with tears and she said I was breaking her heart, that she had given up so much to be there for me since Dad died. Marcus came in and he was angrier, more defensive, his jaw tight, his voice the controlled kind of loud that men use when they want to intimidate without technically yelling. He said, "After everything we've done for you." He said, "You're making something out of nothing." He said, "This is going to damage this family." I let them talk. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry, though I wanted to, not from fear anymore, but from grief. The profound and terrible grief of watching someone you built your life around reveal themselves to be a stranger. When they finished, I said simply and clearly, "I've revoked the medical power of attorney, I've spoken with an attorney, and I'd like you both to leave now so I can speak with my surgical team." Marcus stared at me. Renee said my name like a question. I looked at her and I said, "I love you. I will always love you, but I will not be someone's exit strategy." They left. I had the surgery 3 days later, after a brief postponement to allow my blood pressure to stabilize and to allow Harold to begin the process of reviewing my legal documents. Dr. Okonkwo was wonderful. The valve replacement went smoothly. I spent 5 days in the hospital and 2 weeks in a short-term rehabilitation facility, and I named my old friend from church, a retired school teacher named Beverly Crawford, as my temporary healthcare proxy. Beverly held my hand the first morning I woke up post-surgery, and when I told her what had happened, she said, "Oh, honey, you ran." And I said, "Yes, I did." The months that followed were not easy. I will not pretend they were. There is no clean version of this kind of betrayal. Renee and I have spoken twice since that day in the hospital, brief and careful conversations that felt like walking on ice. I don't know if we will ever find our way back to something whole. I hope we do. I hope it with the part of me that is still her mother and will always be her mother, but I know now that hope cannot be a strategy, not anymore. What I did instead was rebuild, methodically and with purpose. Harold reviewed every document I had signed in the previous 3 years. The co-signed loan was something I would ultimately absorb as a lesson, but the new will Harold helped me draft reflected my actual wishes, including a charitable gift to the county library system where Renee and I used to spend Saturday mornings when she was small. I updated every beneficiary designation on every financial account. I consulted a real estate attorney about the Clarksville property and ultimately decided to sell it, not because I was forced to, but because the right decision for me at 70 was not to manage a house on an acre alone. I chose a senior living community in Murfreesboro with its own garden plots and a walking trail and a community center that hosts a Thursday evening card game. I moved in on a Tuesday in October with my own furniture and Gerald's pecan tree seedling in a pot on my balcony, and I felt, for the first time in years, that my life was entirely my own. I think about aging a lot now, about how our culture quietly trains us to believe that getting older means becoming less, becoming smaller, becoming someone who should be grateful for whatever attention they receive. I believed it more than I knew. I let that belief soften me in places that should have stayed firm. I let love be used as a reason not to ask questions, not to read documents carefully, not to keep one hand on my own life. I won't do that again. There are things I know now that I didn't know before that morning in the hospital. I know that vulnerability is not the same as powerlessness. I know that asking for help and surrendering control are two completely different things. I know that it is possible to love someone deeply and still refuse to be harmed by them. I know that walking out of a situation that threatens you, even when it breaks your heart, even when the person threatening you is someone you raised and fed and sacrificed for, is not weakness. It is the bravest and most necessary thing you can do. If you are listening to this and something in it feels familiar, if there is a voice in your life that keeps circling back to your documents, your finances, your property, if someone is making decisions for you that you didn't fully agree to, if you feel yourself slowly becoming smaller in a relationship that should have made you feel safe, please hear me. You are not being ungrateful. You are not being difficult. You are not paranoid. You are paying attention. And paying attention is how you survive. I was lying in that hospital bed with an IV in my hand and a surgery 30 minutes away, and I still had choices. You have choices too. The moment I understood that, really understood it, I was no longer the patient. I was finally and completely myself. If you like this story of mine, please leave a nice comment and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you.